Yeah, so hello everyone. Thanks a lot for coming here and joining us for this session today. Uh, I would also like to thank you all for joining the Startup India Learning Program and actively participating in it. And you're here today because you have already completed Module 1, which is Idea Validation and Assessment in the Startup India Learning Program. So today we have with us Mr. Vijay Sambamurthi. He's the founder of Lexygen. He's an Indian corporate and securities lawyer with more than 20 years of experience advising VC/P and other funds. He also mentors startups actively. He's also on the panel of mentors for the NASSCOM 10K Startups program. He's also a member of the TIE Bangalore, and as such, he has mentored some dynamic startups with respect to their business plans. He also works very closely and advises a very selected bunch of exciting startups on the legal, structuring, and strategy aspects of the business. He has an experience leading some of India's most complex transactions in areas of private equity, M&A, and infrastructure, and regularly advise some of the market-leading names in the industry on their Indian transactions. We are honored to have you here today, and we will make sure that we'll take all the questions which you guys have pre-submitted so that you can benefit from Mr. Vijay's experience and you can gain something out of this interactive session. So I'll just leave this over to Mr. Vijay. Uh, First of all, again, thank you so much for joining us. And the way this session will go on is we have a couple of questions which have been pre-submitted. So we'll first take those questions. Meanwhile, you can see a chat window on the right-hand side of your screen. So you can just enter your questions there, and we will take your questions towards the end of the session. So let's quickly move to the first question which has been shared here. Uh, the first question is, I am into a service sector. Operations have not started yet. We are working on registration and initial setup of the company. So my question is, when and how should I approach investors? Will bank loan be good, or should I look for angel investors? How do I decide if angel investors are the right people or a bank loan is good? So yeah, if you could help us answer this question, that would be great.
Sure. Firstly, hello everyone, good evening, and congratulations on your decision to start up. It must be quite an exciting journey that you're all commencing. I was in a very similar position 11 years ago when I started up Lexygen. And with regard to this first question, with respect to how do you go about looking at the whole issue of funding, and should you look at debt funding or equity funding, that's a question which always are faced with. Entrepreneurs are faced with that question all the time. And what I very often tell entrepreneurs is, debt is the cheapest way to get your money for your business. Debt is the cheapest way to find your capital to get your business off the blocks. But unfortunately, it is not always available very easily for startups, because if you look at conventional sources of debt, if you look at a bank or a financial institution or an NBFC, they all have norms and regulations which govern how they lend. And unfortunately, most startups typically would not qualify or meet the eligibility requirement of banks. So therefore, very often startups have to deal with the situation of firstly bootstrapping the venture themselves. Bootstrapping means basically putting up their own funds, raise money from your own savings, your family, your friends, etc. So that's the most common one to start off to get your idea off the block. And then comes what is called the angels round, where you go raise money from well-established, successful entrepreneurs who want to give back and who want to invest and support other entrepreneurs. So very often the question of whether you choose debt or equity is not really a matter of choice. your hand is forced on this issue. If you can afford to take debt, as in if you are able to take debt, it is the cheaper source of capital because you don't have to dilute equity. But equity also means that you don't have to face the painful sword hanging over your head of repaying the debt. So, in my view, the saner and more realistic option for funding for a startup is equity.
Got you. I think this is one of the questions which almost everyone faces, what to choose. Should I go to a bank? Should I go to an angel investor? If I should choose an angel investor, then how do I go about it? But we'll come to those questions later on, probably. Right now, we'll quickly move to the second question which we have. The second question says, given the benefits of LLP, why are they still less common? What are the disadvantages, and can an LLP get the tax benefits which government has announced for startups? So, what's your take on that?
Sure. An LLP, as the name suggests, it is a limited liability partnership, and it was introduced to present an alternative business structures. India has often been accused of having very limited, means of doing business, modes of doing business, and LLP legislation was thought to introduce one more attractive type of, entity that can do business. The conventional partnership structure carried with it the risk of unlimited liability for the partners, and LLP was seen as a major step, as an exciting development to provide liability limitation protection for entrepreneurs. The question of why hasn't it really taken off from a startup's perspective is, LLPs were never intended, if you look at the background of why and how the LLP legislation was introduced. And if you look at how LLPs are used in other jurisdictions or other countries, LLPs were really meant to serve as efficient entity models for professional services firms like law firms, accounting firms, consulting firms, and so on and so forth. It has never really been, not just in India but anywhere else, been a very popular model for conventional, say, technology startups. You look at the Valley, you look at Israel, you look at Singapore, any of the other so-called entrepreneurs, LLPs are not really popular. The primary reason for this is that investors are almost never interested in investing money in an LLP because venture capital investors and angel investors essentially are investing in startups with the primary goal of capital appreciation. And the capital appreciation is realized by either a listing of the company or a sale of the company. Now, if you go down the path of an LLP, unlike a private limited company, which is the most commonly used investment business entity for entrepreneurs around the world, unlike a private limited company, an LLP doesn't have shares, it doesn't have a share capital. So you don't have securities that can be traded, you don't have securities that can be bought. So the whole investment ecosystem works on a set of standard terms and well understood concepts. And the LLP doesn't, unfortunately, sit very well into those well understood constructs. That is the simple answer for why it has not really taken off, despite the intent being to protect liability, etc.
Got you. Thank you so much for the answer, and I'm sure it definitely helps. Now we have one very interesting question, which is, can you please explain the detailed structure for a startup? I think this is one question which is very frequent because there's not much education among young entrepreneurs. A lot of people generally have idea, so they kind of know how to move ahead. But when it comes to tax structure, etc., that is when a lot of people kind of start thinking. So, if you could just let us know about the same, I think that's going to help everyone out here.
Sure. So that's a great question, and I would have to be honest, write a book to answer that question in entirety or in a meaningful manner. But at a high level, I think what you're trying to achieve, when founders come to me and seek advice on how they want to structure their startups, I tell them that one of the key things that they should look at is the structure from a tax perspective. Having said that, I also tell them that tax structuring is important, but getting obsessed with tax structuring is a bad idea, because your first focus needs to be on uh, creating a facilitative and enabling framework and structure that helps you raise funds easily, that helps you operate your business easily. Tax is a secondary thing, but you need to plan for it upfront, because when your company has become very valuable later, you cannot really go and plan your tax structure. So it's important to plan it upfront. But at the same time, the tax structure itself shouldn't drive your strategy. That's the first comment I would make on this. The second point I would make is, usually when you're trying to do a tax structure, the key question to think about is, do you want to have an offshore holding company, or do you want to be a company that is headquartered in India? Very often, companies think of having an offshore holding company, not necessarily for tax reasons. Again, I say that your structuring should not be driven by tax, but should be mindful of tax considerations, but it should not be driven by tax. So if your business plan is one, if your business model is one that essentially contemplates a globalized model in some form, let's say you start with India as your primary market, but you want to really globalize and expand into other markets. In situations like that, it's good to have a global holding company that is not in India. And it is usually a good idea to do this upfront rather than do it later. There are some good examples of very valuable companies where, if you look at companies like Make My Trip, which was the first big tech IPO that really put Indian tech startups on the global map. It's actually set up as a US holding company kind of a structure. But something like this needs to be thought through. I cannot emphasize enough. There have been examples of companies not taking the time to think of the tax structuring and of the business flexibilities that they need from a globalization standpoint. And that has resulted in them incurring, they were trying to save money up front and mind space up front, but that has ended up, once the company became valuable, the whole tax restructuring turned out to be a very, very expensive exercise. So I would say there is no simple answer to the question of what is the ideal tax structure for a startup. There are 1,000 answers possibly to that question, depending on what you're trying to do and what your priorities are. But the one point I would definitely make is, please sit with your tax advisors and your lawyers and make sure that you get very, very good advice. And it is worth spending the time and the money and the mind space to figure out your structure up front when your company is worth search. Don't do that exercise after a couple of rounds of funding, because then it's going to turn out to be very expensive for you.
Got you. Again, thank you for the insightful answer. And we'll quickly move to a next question, which is again very interesting and also very generic at the same time. So, our friend has asked, how do I go about raising funds for my startups? Or, in other words, how do I approach investors for my startups? So, how does the process work? At different stages, for example, is the process of approaching investors different, or is it the same? So it would be great, I think, and insightful if you could share kind of your view upon it. So that,
I think that's a very relevant question. How do I go about meeting the investors? How do I go about? So again, there are two different questions there. One is, how do I go about meeting and getting in front of the right investors? And the second question is, how do I pick the right investors? So there are two different questions, right? The first question is, the answer to the first question is, it's a lot of hard work. Firstly, you've got to do a lot of research in terms of what kind of investors you're looking for and what stage of investors you're looking for. The most commonly adopted approach is to land up at investor conferences, which is I'm not at all dismissive of that. I think it's a great forum and a great idea to land up at conferences where a lot of venture capital and angel investors, high net worth guys are speaking and hanging out. But I would also strike a cautionary word there that conferences have become a very lucrative business today, and conferences are dime a dozen. So it's equally important to pick your battle. Use attending conferences as a tool for a venue for a forum. Figure out by speaking to people and doing your research as to which of the fora are good. So which of the conferences are good. So that's one. The second is there are organizations like TIE and NASSCOM, which are essentially not-for-profit organizations that are committed to helping the industry. Make full use of them. I'm a charter member of TIE, and we regularly host and conduct events where all sorts of people come and share their experiences. Some of them are investors, and some of them are entrepreneurs who raise funding from investors. You can learn from them. You can also get to meet other investors who are there. Similarly, NASSCOM has a 10,000 startups program, which I'm sure all of you must be aware of. I'm also on the panel of mentors for that, and very often they have these mentoring programs where there are a bunch of experts who come in from various aspects of the ecosystem or various sections of the ecosystem and who share very valuable advice. And they can also put you in touch with investors, right? So it is really a question of being out there, hitting every channel. Don't restrict yourself to one channel. If somebody has met a top VC in a conference and got a funding done, that doesn't mean that it is the way to do it. As an entrepreneur, you've got to focus on making sure that you and your product and your startup are out there for the right people to see. But at the same time, bear in mind that time is a scarce commodity. Don't squander it on attending every conference in town. Do your research on which fora are important, which conferences are important, and which organizations to spend your time.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this answer as well. And it's definitely going to help again, because I think one of the most important point which everyone faces in their startup journey is, okay, I have an idea, I have a team in place, but what about money and how do I go about raising it? So yeah, this answer is definitely going to help all of us. And there's a next question which is slightly related to the first question, which is, I'll just rephrase the question which is asked by one of our friends. And it's basically, let's say if someone is an angel investor, what are the minimum number of things which he sees before actually investing in a startup? Would he invest in someone who just has an idea, or would he invest in someone who has at least an idea, prototype, and a team? Or how does it work? And similarly for a VC, for example, if someone, what are the factors which a VC would consider while investing, and what are the factors which an angel would consider while investing?
Sure. So I think those are all very, very fair and very relevant questions. I think the simple answer to that is who would like what is often a function of what their investment mandate is or investment strategy. Fund mandate is, fund strategy is. As a general rule, angels are much more likely to take an early stage risk. That's their job, that's their role in the ecosystem, than a VC fund. Of course, there are VC funds which have very active seed programs. There are some dedicated seed funds. There are some emerging funds which are kind of filling the gap between the seed stage and the Series A, all that. But talking about the very early stage pre-seed, I would usually think that it is not very common. I would say, I won't say it never happens, but it is very rare for a VC fund to get themselves involved in a very early stage prototype or concept or idea type of stage, it is more likely that an angel may write a check because they are really looking to support rather than do too much diligence of the product at that stage, etc. And also, an angel is more likely to understand your technology or your product better. So, if you pick the angels that you approach carefully, based on their experience and domain expertise, you are more likely to get funded at a very, very early stage. But if you are looking at raising funding at a later stage, then of course you look at a different universe. You look at seed funds, you look at the large angels or the super angels as they are called, or you could look at the angel networks like the Mumbai Angels and Indian Angel Network and so on, and you could look at venture capital funds. So it all depends on at what stage you seek funding. But remember one thing that very often entrepreneurs miss out is if you go and seek funding early, the price that you pay, the pound of flesh is going to be very heavy, right? Because the earlier in the game an investor comes in, the more risk that investor is taking, and therefore, by definition, they are seeking a higher piece of the pie, higher rewards. So, if you're a prototype and you're trying to get funding, you're probably going to give up a very high percentage of your company for like a $25,000 kind of a sum. Whereas if you can somehow manage and basically get to MVP, or basically figure out your go-to-market strategy and then go to fundraise, your chances of getting funded improve drastically. Firstly, and secondly, you also get better valuation and better terms. So bear that in mind. But yes, that is not always possible. In some cases, you don't have the money, you don't have rich uncles or rich friends and family to help you. You do have to take the help of angels. If you have to do that, then do so sparingly and take it from the right angels who can also add a lot of value to the mentorship.
Got you. So just a follow-up question to this. Can I say that angels mostly look for team idea and technology, whereas VCs would also need some traction data? Or, can I make this statement?
I think that statement would probably be a fair one to make for the most part. Like I said, there are some VCs that do dabble in very early stage bets, but they do so very, very selectively.
Got you. Got you. So yeah, thank you so much for this answer. I think this clears a lot of confusion which is in the air regarding investors and what do they look for. So we have another question which is very interesting, and I think everyone is again curious to know about this. So let's say you take a loan from a financial institution, or let's say you angel invest in your startup, and later the startup goes bankrupt. So in such a case, what happens? Who bears the losses, or are there any implications for the founders? If you could share your views around it.
Look, speaking as a lawyer, the legal answer to that question is pretty straightforward. The reason people set up companies is because they want what is called limited liability. Limited liability means that if the company goes belly up, other than in situations of fraud, etc., where there is something called the piercing of the corporate veil. But apart from cases like that, apart from situations of fraud or bad faith dealing, in most cases, the principle is very clear and well established that there is no recourse to the shareholders of the company. Yeah. So, and I think we all know why this question is even coming up. People about what happened with Stayzilla founders and the founder landing up in jail and criminal case, etc. Now, I think what people need to understand is, as founders of the company, they wear two hats. One is as shareholders of the company, and the second is as directors of the company. Now, as shareholders of the company, they have almost no liability other than the capital that they have already contributed to the company. So, which means that if a company is getting wound up or going belly up, whatever assets are there in the company will be liquidated, and if anything is left over, the creditors will be paid, but the shareholders cannot be touched or cannot be pursued for a debt of the company. Having said that, the second hat that the founder wears is that of a director. Now, if it can be established by an external party that as a director of a company, you did certain things which you ought not to have done and that cost the loss to that party, then they may sue you in that capacity. So, for example, if you issued a check, if the company issued a check and the check was dishonored, the company has liability for it. And since the company is just a legal person and they can't put the company in jail, they can actually proceed against the directors of the company for a bounced check. That's an example of an instance where a founder can be proceeded against, but that is not in his capacity as a shareholder, please understand. It is in his capacity as a director that he needs to make sure that he has taken care, he or she has taken care to fulfill their fiduciary and legal obligations as a director, then they should be fine. What happened with Stagezilla was unfortunate. I don't want to comment on the specifics of whether it was correct or wrong because I don't have the entire set of facts of that case in my hand. But the general principle is very clear for commercial debts of the company which do not have, where the dispute doesn't have the color of a fraud or doesn't have any criminal kind of a color, the founders are protected from liability, and that's the point of setting up a private company.
Got you. Yeah, so now let's move quickly to our next question. You have mentored several startups. You are a part of NASSCOM 10K startups. You are part of TIE. So I think that makes you the best person to answer this. As per you, what are some of the key points which startups forget to consider as far as legal issues are concerned? I mean, in general, what happens is in an attempt to do things faster, startups tend to ignore, at least in the initial stage, some of the legal aspects. And if you could share some of the mistakes which they make and how to overcome them, then that would definitely be very beneficial to our entire audience.
Sure. I think the biggest mistake they make is, the first big mistake they make is not hiring the right lawyer, or worse, not hiring a lawyer at all.
Yeah.
And trying to get documents from the web and trying to put it together. Now, I'm all for getting documents of the web and educating yourself. That's a fantastic and empowered way to be an entrepreneur. But bear in mind that you should do that for the purposes of making sure that you engage constructively with your legal advisors. Do not do that as a substitute for getting legal advice. As the joke goes, your Google research is not the same as my law degree from point of view of giving legal advice. So go to a good law firm. Don't compromise on it. I think this is the one thing. If I look at Silicon Valley or even Israel and compare it with India, the culturally this is still a bit of an evolving issue. Is there are a bunch of founders who see the value in engaging good advisors, whether be it good lawyers or working with good investment bankers or working with good accountants. They see the value in it and they invest in building those relationships. And there are a bunch of founders who really think that it is like getting, it's like a formality to get a lawyer. You need a rubber stamp of the law firm's name to get the document. I need to find the cheapest offering on the market. To me, that is a very dangerous way of going about it. Yeah, that's a very dangerous way of going about it. So that is the first mistake they make, not getting a good advice from the right experts. The second mistake they make is that, and it is understandable, right? It's understandable because entrepreneurs are a passionate bunch of folks. They are very, 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 very driven by their idea and their product and the problem that they're trying to solve. And great entrepreneurs often let this consume them. But very often they forget that the value that they are trying to create can actually be, or forget that they don't realize that the value that they're trying to create in this company or in this business can be seriously imperiled by not addressing the basics on certain basic things about law. Some examples are, very often I find a team has come together, 3 or 4 founders or even 2 founders. They think they are great buddies. They were in IIT together and they were dorm mates. They have great chemistry and they want to start up. Great. But they don't enter into a founder's agreement. They feel awkward. They think, I'm not going to get my buddy to sign an agreement. We trust each other. We have chemistry with each other and all that. It works, and where it works, it's fantastic. Where it doesn't, remember this, agreements are not written for good times. Agreements are written for bad times. If you have bad times, don't be in a position where you could imperil everything that you have for over the last few years. And that's the mistake many entrepreneurs make, is they don't give adequate attention to documentation. The second one is taking a very laissez-faire approach to compliance and to corporate governance. They think it's not important. They think their job is to grow the business, which it is, but then outsource or delegate or hire people who have the right talent and the right ability to give you that advice and to make sure your house is in order. Is good compliance and corporate governance going to get you a higher valuation and funding? Maybe, maybe not. But one thing I'll definitely tell you is if you do not have good corporate governance, if you do not have proper compliance, there's a good chance that a deal that you worked so hard to swing might just fall apart at the last minute. So pay attention to the print, pay attention to the paperwork, pay attention to the compliance, pay attention to the law. Please take it very seriously. That's my request and advice to all entrepreneurs out there.
Got you. Thank you so much. I think this is definitely going to help because a lot of entrepreneurs do neglect the legal aspect of entrepreneurship, especially in the initial stage when you have limited number of funds available and everyone tries to cut down on the expenses. I think legal comes among, one of the first thing you kind of try to cut off that, okay, we are small right now, let's just cut off the lawyer part of it and just do it ourselves. And later when we kind of grow, we'll incorporate a proper lawyer and go about it. Thank you for your advice. And
I'll just say this, right? I'll just say this, Shreya.
Yeah.
If you try to save pennies on getting a good corporate lawyer up front, you will end up spending tons and tons of money on litigating lawyers later.
Interesting. Yeah. So this is something which is an unsaid line. I think thank you so much for sharing it. And we'll move to our next question, which is, after the first round of funding, how does the ESOP pool get created? And if you could share some more details around ESOP, because ESOP is something that is valid not only for entrepreneurs, but for people who are working in some startup at an early stage. So it's kind of a valuable information for both the pools.
Yeah, absolutely. I think ESOPs are very important, and I think they are very, very useful currency and talent for a startup. We all understand that. But in terms of how the ESOP is structured, there is no set way in which it is done necessarily. But usually and most commonly, what happens is that, at least in my experience, I'm sure if you talk to 6 different advisors, you'll get probably 6 different perspectives. But my perspective is as follows, which is that entrepreneurs often don't address the question of ESOPs upfront. And I can understand that, right? I mean, they are bootstrapping. They are trying to figure this whole thing out. They're trying to get the product to market. Their focus is on getting as much done with as little spend or as little outgo as possible. Now, whether the outgo is in terms of cash or outgo in terms of stock, equally important. And I think as a good founder, you have to think hard. You can't be just like you can't be too easy with the way you spend your money. You can't be too easy with the way you spend your stock. But don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that you should be stingy or miserly or difficult in terms of parting with your stock. All I'm saying is most good founders that I have seen usually have this in the back of their minds, and they usually let it be driven around the first round of institutional funding they do. So usually what happens is if either some of them already have a stock option pool carved out. Some of them have actually promised, some deals to get people in, the talent in, and they have to live with it because they have made those promises. But very often what I see is when an investor comes in, a process is set in place where the investor and the founders have a conversation, and they usually earmark what we call an ESOP pool. An ESOP pool is actually a notional allocation, if you will. Those shares are not issued on day one. But let's say you say that there are two founders and each founder has 40% in the company, investor is coming in with, say, 15%, and you say the 5% is the stock option pool. It is not allocated today, it will be allocated tomorrow based on need and the level of performance and so on and so forth. So there are many ways of doing it, and in some cases, founders have thought through this. There are serial entrepreneurs who've done this before, so they have a clear path and clear thinking and strong views on how the ESOP should work. And but more often than not, the whole process around ESOPs and how much goes into it and stuff like that is driven by the early stage venture capital investors.
Got you. Yeah, thanks a lot for the answer, because this is one question which is relevant to everyone, from employees working in startups to entrepreneurs, because there's a lot of say around ESOPs. When someone got ESOPs worth, let's say 10K, within 5 years he could encash it and make. He made a lot of cash out of it because the startup valuation grew drastically, etc. So everyone is very curious about ESOPs, and that was one of the main questions which everyone had. So now we have one of the questions which Abhishek is asking. His question is, let's say I was very confident that an incubator is going to choose my startup, but I couldn't get through. So how should I go about it? What changes should I make so that I get into an incubator, or should I approach angels game, or how should I go about it?
Sure. First thing, Abhishek, is don't take it personal, right? I'm sure you know this, and I'm sure you've seen this around you. Entrepreneurship is a lot about handling failure. The ultimate success of successful entrepreneurs has also been, the culmination of numerous failures which have handled well. I think that's how I broadly distinguish between successful entrepreneurs and the ones that have not managed to do it. This is certainly not the only reason, but one of the biggest reasons I think is successful entrepreneurs have learned valuable lessons from their failures and their mistakes, and you are certainly doing the right thing by focusing on what should you do and why did it not happen. But like I said, do not feel dejected by it or do not take it personal. There are 1,000 reasons why an incubator or an accelerator could have turned you down, and just because you didn't fit an accelerator's program requirements or the mandates of their program doesn't mean that you cannot be funded by somebody else. But having said that, the one thing I would suggest you do is to try to find out what was the reason. Yes, again, these accelerators and incubators and even venture capital funds get so many applications that it may not be practically possible for them to always give detailed reasons for why they turn down applicants. But it is important nonetheless to try to find out if you have a good rapport with any, if you developed a rapport or even a good working relationship with any of the folks there, try to understand from them what were the key points which they thought were chinks in your armor, and have a debate about it. It may be that they have a very valid point. Very often these failures can actually tell you what you need to fix and why. And I don't know if it's not clear to me from the question whether you have a co-founding team or whether you're the sole founder. If you're the sole founder, it's a little lonelier because you got to do this by yourself. But if you have some co-founders, I think you need to have some sort of a brainstorm based on the feedback that you receive from the incubators. Yes, it's a little tougher if you do not receive any feedback at all from them, then you just have to try to figure out what could have gone wrong, and look at other companies that were accepted by them and try to figure out what about them was more positively different than you. But like I said, the more important point is it is not the end of the world. Many of my clients who have advised have been turned down by like literally scores and scores of funds, and they just steadfastly refuse to give up and just keep trying to fix the nixes and keep going back to the next guy. I think you got to keep doing that. But yes, it's important not to keep making the same mistake over and over again. If there is a mistake, you need to figure that out. The reason for the denial or the rejection could be that you don't fit into their program, which is fine. But if the reason for the rejection is something is fundamentally lacking or flawed or not so apparent in your model, then you need to think about that and pivot.
Got you. Thank you so much again for sharing insights over this. Because I think as an entrepreneur, there are a lot of times which we do encounter wherein you feel that, maybe you should just stop doing this, maybe going to a comfortable corporate job is the right thing to do. But then I think that's one of the reasons where an entrepreneur has to have that passion, so in order to keep going, so that he is motivated and he keeps his team motivated, such that they do a good teamwork and finally come up with a good solution and a good startup and finally succeed. So yeah, thanks for that question. And we have one very interesting question which one of our friends is asking. His question is, why is trademark registration important? I think this again comes from the fact that, when it comes to legal and registration part, that is the part which startups want to focus the least, and that is why he's asking this question as to, why is trademark registration so important? What if I, kind of don't want to do it, or how do I go about it?
Yes. Quite simply put, trademark registration is important for two reasons. I will call one as offensive and the other is defensive, right? What I mean by that really is the offensive part of what I'm talking about is if you create value and if you create a brand, creating a brand takes years and years and effort, lots of effort, and often lots of money. After doing all that and creating a brand, if somebody else is going to monetize it, that is a fundamentally wrong thing. But it's not only legally wrong. I think it's fundamentally morally wrong, ethically wrong. So, as an entrepreneur who's built a company and who's built a brand, I think it is your duty and your right to defend the trademark. It's your intellectual property. It is what you have worked so hard to create, and it is what you should be monetizing and reaping the benefits of, you and your investors and your backers, your shareholders. Yeah? So that is what I call an offensive or whatever. Defensive could also be where you don't want your brand to be harmed, right?
Yeah.
For example, if you're working really hard to build, for example, an e-commerce website, and somebody's started a porn site, the same name or a very similar sounding name, right? It does potentially a lot of damage to your business. Yes, on a lighter note, maybe it'll actually help your business, but who knows? I think in most circumstances, such kind of abusive use of trademarks is sometimes done as an extortionary trick. It is basically about holding a brand holder to ransom, right? If tomorrow somebody or similar to yours, he is doing serious damage to your reputation and to your brand, and therefore the trademark has that I am the owner of this trademark and nobody else can use it, right? So it has both those aspects to it, defensive and offensive.
Got you. So we have one very interesting question again, which is, let's say if I am selected by an incubator program,
Mhm.
Now, how careful should I be before I share all my idea and the research which I've done with them? I mean, there's always I think this is one common question which everyone has, that, what if I tell my idea to someone and they kind of start working on that idea and actually scale it? I think this is one question which a lot of entrepreneurs ask. Although I personally believe that it's not more about the idea, it's more about the execution and how
Mhm.
well you do it. But even then, if you could share your views around, are there any risks involved in sharing your idea with incubators? Are there any key points to consider? Is there anything which needs to be signed, or something around it? Then that would be great.
Sure. That's actually a great question, and a question that I get asked a lot as well.
Yeah.
And the simple answer is, it is the reality of life that no VC that I'm aware of or I'm familiar with will sign an NDA. NDA is a non-disclosure agreement. No one's going to sign a confidentiality agreement or an NDA. I suspect incubators and accelerators are no different. And I think, there's a very good reason why they would not sign an NDA or a confidentiality agreement is because while you may be convinced that your idea is truly unique, I have seen this time and again. Different people do get the same idea at the same point in time or around the same point in time. So if there is a VC investing in tech and their mandate is pretty broad, which is usually the case with most VCs, odds are very high that they will meet 3 or 4 or even 20 companies which are all trying to do the same thing, right? So it is very difficult for them to sign an NDA and commit to obligations where they can put the fund at risk where a disgruntled entrepreneur sues them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the logic behind or rationale behind why a fund, and I advise a lot of VC funds, right? So that is why I'm able to share this perspective. The fund's perspective with you is, it's a huge liability risk for a VC fund to say that they will not, because it can very easily be argued that I met you on so and so date and you took this, you invested in company B, you didn't invest in me, and company B is doing the same thing, right? The reality is that you and company B could have had the same idea, and maybe company B had a better GTM than you did. Maybe they had a better execution strategy than you did, right? So that is, I think the fundamental thing that you need to understand to help you make your peace with this reality is that VCs are not in the business of being entrepreneurs. They are in the business of backing entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
And a very small percentage of companies that come to them to back, right? I mean, if you look at the statistics,
Yeah.
I think less than 3% of companies, startups, get any form of funding at all.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a very, very harsh and unforgiving statistic.
Yeah.
And therefore, if you have to be in that 3%, you shouldn't be placing an entry barrier to a VC looking at you. Because if you say sign an NDA, most VCs, or almost all VCs I know, are going to say, sorry, but we can't do this.
Yeah.
And so then how do you bring yourself to be at this thing? I would say do a lot of DD, do a lot of research. DD is due diligence. Do a lot of research. Find out more about VCs, which VCs have a good reputation. Yeah, which VCs have, there are websites in the US where entrepreneurs rank VCs. Yeah. I'm not very, I don't recall the name of the website. I think it's called thefunded.com, where people go and rank VCs. So there are message boards like Quora where you can raise these questions about, what do you think of these VCs, etc. But once you do your research and get your comfort, go with the flow and go with it. Because if you are very selective in the information that you share, there is a risk that, yes, I'm not saying you have to share each and every bit of every line of code that you write.
Yeah.
What I mean is the business idea has to be shared with them in a manner that helps them make that decision, right?
Yeah.
And if your business plan or if your deck is very sparse on information,
Yeah.
odds are high that you will not get adequate attention from them. and therefore your chances of getting funded are low.
Got you. Got you. So yeah, I think that helps and answers the question. I think this was one of the most frequent questions, which almost comes in mind of every person, but people are just reluctant to kind of say it when it comes to saying it to the incubators or to the VCs. And thank you for sharing your insights around that. We have we'll quickly move to our last question, which is, what are your views on crowdfunding as a funding platform? And when should we go for crowdfunding, or what are the merits and demerits? What's your take on that?
See, I think crowdfunding is a very exciting and fantastic way to raise funding.
Yeah.
It is a fairly well evolved and well understood mechanism in the US, right?
Yeah.
There are some, everybody's aware of Kickstarter, and everybody's aware of some great companies and products which have been crowdfunded. Now, in India, there are a couple of attempts that have been made at creating crowdfunding businesses, but the regulatory framework is unclear. Regulatory framework does not, in my opinion, permit raising equity funding through a crowdfunding platform. For example, there are limits on how many shareholders a private limited company can have. There are limits on how many, for example, if there are a certain number of shareholders beyond which you are making an offer to, then it has to follow the prospectus requirements under the Companies Act and the securities laws, right? So all that is very difficult to manage in a crowdfunding platform, because in a crowdfunding platform, you could have 5 people funding it, or you could have 1 million people funding it in theory, yeah, and that becomes very difficult. So crowdfunding has picked up in causes. Crowdfunding has picked up for media-related projects where a specific project is being funded. Movie, somebody's an independent filmmaker and he or she wants to raise 10 crores to make a movie, and people back the idea because they like it. So it's more driven by, we want to back you, we think you're doing a great kind of thing. But the true equity crowdfunding, where I say I'm raising funding and I'm putting up a case on a platform and people please come and fund me, that is in a very, 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 very nascent stage, I think, in India. There are some websites which are attempting to create this ecosystem or this kind of a platform, but I think there are doubts around the regulatory feasibility of such approaches today. So as things stand today, I would not say it is a very viable means of raising funds. But but in the future, who knows? It could become very, very exciting. Okay.
Yeah, that's definitely there. So yeah, with this, we pretty much come to the end of the session. Thank you so much for being there with us today. We learned some really important things regarding ESOPs, regarding how to approach investors. We also learned how angel investors look at while investing in a startup as compared to what a VC looks for. We did realize how important it is to take care of legal aspects, or to have a lawyer while you start up, and not just neglect it normally a lot of entrepreneurs do at an early stage of startup. And finally, I think one of the most important thing which you also highlighted was, as an entrepreneur, all that matters is keep going, keep iterating. If you want to fail fast and come back strong, learn from your mistakes, and yes, do not repeat the same mistakes. So maybe you can learn from someone else's mistake instead of learning from your mistake, and that's definitely very important. So thank you everyone for being with us today. Again, thank you so much, Vijay, and the session was really insightful. With this, we'll put an end to this session.
The session is mine, and thank you everybody for the patient listening. And I hope that this was useful, and I hope that you will take legal compliance and legal documentation and legal structuring as a very important part of the value creation process that you're setting out to achieve. Don't take it as a painful thing to have at the lowest cost, treat it as a very important part of what we're trying to do. You're working so hard to create value, don't jeopardize it. And all the best. Very, very exciting talking to all of you. I certainly hope it was useful for you. I had a lot of fun. And thank you, Shreya, for hosting this and for all the great questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much for everyone else, all the visitors. Keep tuned. Try taking the Startup India Learning Program. I'm sure you'll gain a lot of insights out of it. And once you complete the program, we look forward to successful ventures which you guys start. And do write to us and let us know about the ventures and how the program has helped you. If you have any feedback for the program, for the session, please feel free to write to us, and we would love to incorporate any changes, any suggestions, any feedback which you have in our further sessions as well as in the program. So thank you so much, everyone. Hope you had a nice time.
Bye. Bye, everybody. Take care.